here at the John Steinbeck Library. It's December 11th, 2010, and we have Loretta Williamson and Robin Lee. And they're going to talk about their experiences in Salinas. Loretta, do you want to give us some background on how you got here?
It's kind of a nice story. The company I worked for opened a branch office in Salinas in 1979. And they did 2 weeks of promotion and had Hollywood stars and things. And I came down and worked the PR for that and met a number of really lovely people who then became customers of our organization. And 2 years later, the office was not running as smoothly as they had hoped. And they asked me to come down and take the position of operations officer. And when I got here, one of the families that I had met, the Williamsons, Mrs. Williamson was dying of cancer, which was just a real heartbreak. But Mr. Williamson was a wonderful man who supported her through this dreadful period of time, kept her at home and all the rest of it. Very much admired him. And after an appropriate period of time had passed, he asked me if I'd like to have lunch with him. And of course, you support somebody who's grieving. And we had lunch a few times. And then he asked me for dinner, and I thought perhaps maybe there's more here than just friendship. But I also thought about this man, and I thought how fortunate I was that somebody this fine would be interested in me. And to make a long story short, I married Mr. Williamson and moved into a house in Salinas in July of 1981. And I'm still in the same house.
And I guess you raised some children there?
My children, my boys then were teenagers. They were 16 and 18, and my daughter was 21. And so my daughter was already off at college. But my sons did finish their education here. And when we first came to Salinas, they kind of looked around and went, wow, what is there to do? Because there wasn't a whole lot. But we were really blessed where we live on Hoover Street, just across behind the houses that we live in, is this lovely little creek. And they used to go to the creek and play all sorts of games and catch tadpoles and just generally roam and do the kinds of things that boys do at the creek and come back thoroughly slimed and dirty. And also, we used to take bicycle rides. That was another way that we took advantage of the beautiful area we live in. And I'd load my boys and maybe a couple of their friends in the van with their bikes and go up to Fremont's Peak. And I would drop them off, and they would have toolkits, patched kits, water, maybe a sandwich or granola bars or something. I would drive home, and then they would bicycle from Fremont's Peak back to my house. And if they didn't make it by 5 hours, then I started to be concerned. But usually about 4 hours, and they were home, happy, starving, and exhausted. So they did a lot of bicycling, they did a lot of playing and roaming. Across from the creek, there's wide open fields still where they're growing produce and so on. There's greenhouses, and there's little pockets of orchards, and there's some wonderful places back there that you can get to really quickly as a boy on a bicycle.
Sounds like
it was a nice life.
Yeah, it sounds lovely. Can you describe the creek as it was when? Can you describe the community and the creek, the little area?
Well, it was very much a family community, nice families, very friendly, self-supportive. We did do like neighborhood watch and that sort of thing. And I can remember we women who were home during the day when it was time for the children to come home from school, we all went out in the front yards so that we could keep on the children. They walked to and from school in those days. And
what school was that?
Well, it was Santa Rita. And then during the time I was living there, they built Gable and View, and then the children were going off there for the middle school. And a lot of children, lots of kids loving that creek. It was a lot cleaner, and I think it had more life to it than it does now. And all of the children were down there playing all sorts of games. I can remember when I first lived in that house, I used to have big fat toads in the yard. I mean, they were wonderful things. And there were these little frogs every season they'd come, and they had these huge voices, but they were about the size of your thumbnail. And I used to love the sound of the frogs. And yeah, it was a really nice community. I think the environment was a lot healthier in those days. Some of these things have disappeared. I can't remember how long it's been now since the frogs have been gone, but I do miss them. But we get visited by possums and raccoons, and all sorts of things come from that creek.
Was there still a horse farm over there when you moved in?
Yes.
I've heard about that.
Yes, there was. Oh, and one of the girls, when I was talking about, that lives across the street, she's 31 now. I've known her whole life. Anyway, she used to go there and volunteer. She would clean stables and things for the ability to ride the horses. She loved it.
And it was just right behind you on the other side of the street.
Right, yeah. Another really cool thing.
Yeah, that area now is duplexes and multifamily housing. And I don't know when they built that.
Well, when I first got there, that little group of houses that all of the President Streets were the only houses out there, and all of this other stuff grew up since. My husband and I had this bet about the Hardin Ranch. Mrs. Hardin was still there and living in the ranch, and I told him I had seen this happen in the Santa Clara Valley as a child, and I said, they're going to pave it over and turn it into all these things that happened up there. I just hope it doesn't happen as rapidly. And he said, oh, never in my lifetime. So I think it was like in the 1990s, and I named a year when I thought it was going to happen, and the year came and it hadn't happened yet. So I gave him $5. And the next year they broke ground on the Hardin Ranch Plaza, and he gave me my $5 back. And he shook his head. He couldn't believe it. He said, it's never going to happen in my lifetime. And I said, yes, it is. I've seen it before.
So you've seen quite a few changes come to that area in, let's see, what would it be, 40 years?
Well, 30 anyway. 81 to, well, this July will be exactly 30 years that I've been in that particular house.
Yeah. The frogs aren't there anymore. How's the wildlife doing? Do you still have the same?
I still have some wildlife, and that was a personal choice. I feel like we're exposed to too many chemicals in our lives as it is. And so I have stayed completely organic on that little piece of land. There's been no poisons, no spraying, no whatever. I'm an organic farmer, and so I still have a lot of habitat. I have probably the most huge garden snake you'd ever want to see. It's lived there for years, and it keeps the rodent population under control, and it and I are non-aggressive and we're fine. I have all sorts of birds. And I consciously planted like bottle brush and fuchsias and what they call the butterfly bush, all of those things to bring the animals to me. So I have a pretty vigorous habitat in my yard. It's not as good as it used to be, but I still have a lot of animals that come, birds and so on, that come and visit me, and I love it. I absolutely adore it.
Well, 2 years ago we formed a group, and we went around and gave certificates of appreciation to people who had native drought-tolerant plants in their front yard and not lawn. And Loretta was one of our first recipients. It's a marvelous yard. It's full of good habitat for as garden snakes and birds and butterflies. It's beautiful. So it's very appreciated.
I've heard other neighbors talk about various times when they've had either rats or mice come in, and I've never had problems like that. It's a natural rodent control.
Yeah, it's stunning. And you told us that you started, when did you put your yard in, and why did you do that? It was about water and...
The biggest share of it was about water. I've lived in California my whole life, and I understand that water is a limited resource, and that we're really very foolish to try to act like we live in England with these green lawns, et cetera, et cetera. And there was grass. It was a yard when I first got there. And I had been in the house a couple of years when I looked at it, and I said, I'm taking the grass out. And my husband looked at me and said, you're what? And I said, I'm taking the grass out in the front yard. And he said, okay. He wasn't quite sure what to expect, but if that's what I wanted to do, go for it. So I removed all of the grass, and I started amending the soil, because it's really rich clay. I mean, this is the soil that produces all these produce here in the, but it needed to be worked. I needed to do some amending, and so I used compost and composted steer manure and that sort of thing. Boy, got it in good shape. And then I started just kind of doing like an English garden, but a cottage garden, where I put in things that I like, but also things that are very, very resilient, need precious little care. And proof of that is this last year, I'm getting really tired, and don't have the energy even to water anymore. I maybe watered 5 times in the entire year of 2010. And I referred to it as survival of the fittest. And there's a whole lot that's really fit.
Oh, her yard's beautiful in the summer.
The summer,
gorgeous.
Well, spring, summer, and fall.
Yeah.
But even now I have things blooming. I mean, I have enough planted that I have color and bloom going all the time. And I do a big cleanup twice a year. I do a spring and fall cleanup. And as I'm cleaning, I'm taking out the various things that are done growing, et cetera, cutting them back, and already the next thing is coming. You know, it just keeps cycling through.
That was wonderful to take photographs through the seasons.
Well, some of my family has. I'm not as good about the photography because I had the professional photographer in the family. I was sort of embarrassed about but I do have access to some of the things that he did for me. I have lots of bulbs in, you know, the sorts of things that once you get them going, they just come year after year after year. My daffodils have had enough time that they've multiplied again and again and again. Yeah.
Oh, that's...
But my approach to the yard was, first of all, not so much water. Secondly, habitat. And thirdly, my children, my grandchildren, my family and I have used that yard. And so when we're there, we're not being exposed to, you know, we can play and enjoy it without... So it was a conscious decision, yes.
Would you say that there's a community feeling out in North Salinas? Do you have any kind of a...
It ebbs and flows. There are times when there's been a lot of community feeling. Back maybe 10 years ago, the street just around the corner from me, Lenny, we were closing it off on the 4th of July, and pretty much the entire block, including some of us on Hoover, got together and did a joint 4th of July thing in the street. We had to get permission, of course, to barricade, but we did. So there, a little bit of an ebb and flow. There was a period of time when the gangsters moved in. We had Norteños living in 3 houses that I could throw a rock at. And I was not very happy about that particular period of time. It wasn't really great, but I said that was my house when they got there, and it was going to be my house when they left. And it is, and they are gone.
How long were they there?
They lasted about 3 years.
What time period was that about?
Oh, this is back a while ago. Maybe 15 years ago now. But it was pretty scary. It was pretty scary. The house right next door had a guy in a wheelchair because he had a bullet in his spine. And he was kind of like the head of that particular Norteño grouping. And a lot of his friends came and hung there. And some of them were quite young. Funny story about my husband. When they first had moved in one night, they were having a really loud party, and it was 10:30 at night. My husband walked out in the backyard, and he goes, "Shut up!" And they kind of, you know, and they said, "Oh, are we bothering you?" And he goes, "It's 10:30 at night, and you're making a lot of noise." And they said, "We don't want any trouble," and they did quiet down. And it sort of was the beginning of the whole thing. Well, then they discovered that he was a retired Air Force and that he had done 30 years, career man, and they actually admired him. And so he could say things like that and not get in trouble. But I told him when he was hollering these kids, I said, "Honey, they're walking around with guns in their belt." And he goes, "Wouldn't be the first one that shot at me."
Well, were your children around then?
My youngest son was, and that was a little bit scary. The youngest son, because he had to figure out how to walk through this, not be a part of it, but also not get hurt. And there was one day he was coming home. I actually was working in my front yard, beautiful Saturday, and I thought I heard gunshots. And just then my son drove in and he goes, "Mom, 2 blocks up the street, they just killed somebody." And apparently this young boy had crossed the wrong persons, and they shot him in his front yard washing his mother's car, and the boy was laying there bleeding as my son drove past, which was pretty awful, you know.
Yeah, it is.
And the thing that was really terrible is that we in the neighborhood were pretty sure who did it, but there was no way of actually proving it, and they basically got away with murder. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very sad.
Yeah.
But things
It
are a little
is.
bit better now.
Oh, a
as
lot
far as-
better. A lot better. They only stayed a certain length of time and then they moved on out. And so there isn't any, well, I shouldn't say any, but there's not a whole lot of gang activity. There's not a whole lot of gangsters living there. There's a certain amount of tagging, but we live in Salinas, there's tagging everywhere.
Yeah.
But I do not feel uncomfortable or afraid or whatever. I go in and out at night often. And
Yeah, when we moved in there, in that neighborhood, there was, it's right where Fort Ord bus left, closed, and so the real estate crashed at that time, the early 90s. And some of the houses were abandoned and overgrown, and you don't have any of that now. Even now, with all the mortgage problems, we don't have abandoned houses that are overgrown and just sitting there. We don't seem to have that in our neighborhood, so it's very nice.
That's interesting that you say that. Do you have any, I know that when there was a difference between when you had a lot of the military, especially the young military, living out in the North Salinas area. I think you did, didn't you? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they abruptly left. But how did the military living out there affect the community? Did it have
I actually thought it was positive, because generally they're pretty good citizens, and they have a fairly firm hand on their children with fairly high expectations of behavior, etc. Yeah.
So these are the families that I was thinking about, the soldiers, but they're not soldiers out there in the...
Yes, they were, but they were generally family men.
Were they?
Yes, I don't remember very many, if any, single. They went other places. It was a family community. Generally, they would be renters, and generally when they rented, it would be husband, wife, and a couple of kids. And they were a positive influence as far as I was concerned. And of course, anytime they figured out about my husband's military background, they were really nice to us.
Yeah, it seems our community is a desirable place for families because the houses are smaller, but they have big backyards. And your newer houses these days have big houses and no yard. So if you have a dog, or if you want a garden or in the back, and what we're trying to get the word out that you can also have garden in your front yard. And Margaret Todd, do you know her? She's on Van Buren near the intermediate school, has put garden in a vegetable garden with plants, also with landscaping plants. And people actually stop and talk to her now. Did you find when you changed your yard around that people stop and talk to you all the time?
Absolutely.
And that's what she said.
When I was working on it, even now, I'll be working in the front yard and people walk by and then they'll stop and they'll discuss it with me. And they're really interested about my approach to the fact that I haven't got time or room for grass, thank you. I pretty much put plants and flowers everywhere I can, and little seating areas, little vignettes where you can be comfortable. As my husband aged, he would come out, and I had some seating areas where he could be comfortable, and he could keep me company in the yard while I worked, and we could visit back and forth and that sort of thing. And we used to have our breakfast in the front room, the front bedroom, where there was a huge big window where we could look out on the front garden, and he just loved watching the changes in the yard over the seasons and the birds coming, because I had pyracantha right there, and of course the birds always come and get drunk on the pyracantha. Anyway, he loved watching all of those kinds of things, and of course the hummingbirds do wonderful acrobatics for us, and
Oh, I know. I was trying to think what wildlife you actually would have out there, the birds and do you know the species and names?
Well, I know we have mockingbirds. We've had mockingbirds nesting there for years and years and years. It's like the family keeps coming back. The generations keep coming back. About 20 years ago, there was one particular male that was so cute. He sat on the top of the fireplace next door and sang all spring long. And it was so wonderful, but he's there hopping up and down and singing. And finally, my husband looked at me and he goes, "It's really nice, but do you know what that fireplace looks like now?"
Full of bird poop.
And along the back fence in my backyard, I have trees and bottle brush that I've grown to be trees, and they are just like an aviary. I mean, as the sun goes down, especially, it's just beautiful. They're out there going to roost and singing, and lots of nests and babies, and yeah, it's great. I love it.
Did you interact with people from Bolson Knolls? It's just across the street, across Russell. Did you have friends living there?
Actually, I knew a couple of people that lived back in there.
It's
yes.
kind of two very different communities, it seems.
It was. It really was.
Still is.
I did have friends that lived over there back in the Bolson Knolls area. And we used to walk a lot, and so we walked all of that. It was part of the trying to stay young and healthy. We did a lot of walking around our area. You would have seen my husband and I walking from where we lived up to Northridge. We covered that whole area. And we did a lot of walking at the beaches too, which we thought was again an advantage of living in this area. There's so many beautiful beaches so close. We went to Jack's Peak. We hiked Jack's Peak. I love it in the springtime when the irises are blooming. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it is a stunning area.
Well, you said that the Bolsa Knolls area and the North Salinas, Santa Rita area were very different. How did they do?
Well, among other things, one is in the city and one is outside the city. One has sewers, etc. One has septic tanks. And I think that's a different type of person that lives in the Bolsa Knolls. Some of them are very nice homes, but a lot of them I think are quite poor. Isn't that your impression?
Yeah, the homes built there, a lot of people built themselves. And they, I don't know if you've heard this, but I understood that a lot of people, well, some of the first settlers there were from the Dust Bowl era that first came there. And so consequently, when they built the house, there wasn't a lot of materials at hand, or they didn't have a lot of money. And so and they're still there, these houses. And so they must have done an okay job. They're still standing, and they're still being lived in. But this is the way I understood some of that. Do you know that?
Yes,
story?
I was surprised when I was in the bank because how many people came from the South or the Southwest. There was a lot of people from Arkansas and Oklahoma, and yeah.
And they lived in Bolsa Knolls?
Yes, yes.
And did they live in Santa Rita as well?
Not as much. It's kind of interesting, isn't
Very
it?
different populations from what I understand.
Even my
And
son
they didn't
talks about
mix
that.
much.
He said it was like there were these mini pockets of people, and that you got a completely different group. Like maybe there was exceedingly redneck here, and maybe Dust Bowl here, and maybe Hispanic over there. Yeah.
So my impression was that it would have been during the 50s that when it was after the war and people were on, they got GI Bill benefits, and so they were building a great deal out in North Salinas, and then the people from the Alice South, a lot of the people who had come from Arkansas, Oklahoma, moved out into the North Salinas area.
Well, the houses I'm living in were built in 1975.
So they're pretty new.
I think they were kind of like the first subdivision out on the north. I mean, actual subdivision.
Yeah, it's actually called Northridge Estates. And it was begun to be, I don't know when it was finished being built, but I know it started in the early 70s, because Joan's father and mother lived in one of the first houses built in the subdivision.
Well, my particular house was built in 75. My husband bought it in 78, and we moved into it in 81. So.
Yeah. So Northridge Estates sits between the older communities of Bolsa Knolls and the old community of Santa Rita. But even when Northridge Estates was not there, they were two very separate communities, and they didn't mix much. From when I talked to people who grew up there, the people I've talked to in Santa Rita, they did not play with the people from Bolsa Knolls. Because I asked them, did you even go to Bolsa Knolls? No, we didn't do that.
It's very funny, too.
I assume so, because Santa Rita was the only elementary school in the area for a long time.
They would have gone to the same school.
Yeah, there's been a school there since the 1800s, from what I understand.
Yeah, it's an old community, Santa Rita.
Yeah, and the first county hospital was where Lamplighter is now, was where the first county hospital was built. So it's had a lot of input, but the community of residences, the Bolsa Knolls and Santa Rita were very separate.
They still are.
And they're only like an eighth of a mile apart.
Oh, yeah.
They're very close.
I could throw a baseball. Yeah.
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 Yeah, and they just stayed fairly separate. And I don't know even though there was only one school, and I'm assuming that they went to the same school. I imagine.
Oh, I think so.
I don't think there was another school. I don't know. Do you know when La Jolla Elementary was built?
I don't actually know, because I didn't have anybody in elementary school then.
Yeah.
But it was definitely later.
Later, because it's in the newer part of Bolsa Knolls. There's an old section like everywhere else and a new section. And La Jolla Elementary is in the newer section of Bolsa Knolls. And I don't know when that was built.
Yeah.
It's an older school, but I know for sure that there's been a school continuously where Santa Rita Elementary is, I think, since the 1800s.
Yeah, probably, because it's a really old community.
Yeah.
A long time old. How about the high school? Can you tell us anything about the high school? Boys would have gone, right?
One boy. And it was North Salinas High. And he didn't like it.
On Alvin? Oh, that was there then.
And he should have gone there for his senior year of high school, his junior and his senior year of high school. And he refused.
And why didn't he like it?
Well, we had come from Santa Cruz, and at that time there wasn't a very large Hispanic population in Santa Cruz. Changed since then. But down here there were a lot, and he was a definite minority, and he just was not comfortable there. And our solution to it was that he got permission to register at Hartnell. And he went to Hartnell. He finished his education at Hartnell.
The community college?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, did he really?
Yes.
For junior and senior year?
Well, he did his junior year. His senior year he did at Hartnell.
Oh,
Yeah.
His junior year was at Alvin? North? North,
But he
what's it called? North Salinas High?
Yeah, North Salinas High. Now he has a stepson that's going to North Salinas High, and it's no problem. But when he was a kid, there was no way he was going to
So
go
your
there.
son still lives in the area?
Yes, yeah.
Well, maybe we should invite him to come and chat.
Well,
Yeah.
of course, Santa Cruz and Salinas are very different communities, too. So,
Oh, yes.
Yeah, but Santa Cruz was quite conservative for a long time until they built the university.
Right. But there's a lot of layers to Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
There are about 5 different types of populations, and I came across a lot of that, again, working in the banking business. You had the people that were the educators at the college, and then you had the people who were in the college, and you had the wealthy retirees, then you had the young families, and then of course you had the burned out hippies. Yeah, it was quite a combination.
And so did you find that similar layering here when you...
No.
Oh, okay, so what was the difference then?
Well, when I first came to, you're going to love this, when I first came to Salinas, people in the company teased me that I was down in Salinas fleecing the Hicks, which was so far from the truth I couldn't believe it. So I told them, I said, well, those Hicks you're referring to come in 3-piece business suits with their attorney to do business. And I said, I think it's called agribusiness as opposed to farming. And I said, there's a great deal of money in Salinas and a lot of history and a fair amount of, education and taste and refinement. They're not all just quote-unquote Hicks, thank you. And then I started talking about the fact that it was a lovely community. I mean, in those days I felt very, very safe. It was a soft, nice community, not huge, big city, not growing fast, and so close to so many things that we enjoyed. I enjoyed my time here. I like this. And now I'm at the stage where I say I'm kind of like sinking into the earth. They're just going to plant me right where I am.